forest was quiet, too quiet. He crouched low, every sense on high alert as he scanned the alien terrain around him. Survival here was a daily negotiation, an endless series of challenges. He'd learned to move like the creatures of this world. Silent, patient, careful of every step. The trees stretched high above, their deep purple leaves filtering sunlight into shifting, emerald shadows. This forest was his home now, an endless labyrinth of threats and secrets. His clothes were worn, patched with the fabrics he'd scavenged from his surroundings, and his boots had taken on the deep, earthy stain of the alien soil. He could feel every root and rock beneath his feet, guiding him as he moved through the shadows. He didn't know how long he'd been here. Time had blurred, blending into the cycles of the planet's moons. The only thing that remained clear was his purpose: survive. He'd become a hunter, an explorer, a ghost of this place. Today, though, something felt different. A faint rustling caught his attention. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to the worn handle of his makeshift weapon. Over the years, he'd encountered all manner of creatures, some enormous, with teeth like knives, others small but deadly, hidden among the strange foliage. But this sound was different, deliberate. It wasn't the unpredictable scurry of an animal or the soft hum of alien insects. Then, he saw her. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a fluidity and grace he'd never seen before. She was tall, her skin a pale blue that glinted faintly in the filtered light. Her silver eyes scanned the terrain, assessing it with practiced precision. She wore a form-fitting armor that looked both ceremonial and battle-ready, and strapped to her back was a weapon, a sleek, curved blade that gleamed with an edge sharper than anything he'd ever crafted himself. He watched her from the cover of a dense thicket, his breath barely stirring as he studied her movements. She was not like him. Her confidence, the way she moved through the alien landscape, told him that this was her world, not his. And yet, something about her seemed almost familiar. Like him, she carried a sense of purpose, a certain focus that only years of survival could cultivate. He took a slow, steadying breath and stepped out of the shadows. Her gaze snapped to him instantly, her hand moving to her weapon. But she didn't draw it. She simply watched him, her silver eyes narrowing slightly. "A human," she said, her voice low and clear, carrying a hint of surprise. He nodded, unsure if words were the best choice. This was the first intelligent life he'd seen in years. Another being who walked upright, who spoke with intent. "What brings you to this place?" she asked, not relaxing her stance. Her voice held an edge of suspicion, but her eyes were curious, studying him as though he were an enigma to solve. "A rough landing," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "A long time ago. I don't know how long, but long enough." She tilted her head, clearly assessing his answer. "This world is not kind to visitors. Few survive more than a cycle. Guess I got lucky," he said with a faint, wry smile, though there was no humor behind it. Luck hadn't brought him this far. It was caution, patience, and a willingness to adapt. Her expression softened, if only slightly. She nodded, and her hand relaxed by her side. "I am Kayla, of the Virkesh," she introduced herself, her voice more neutral now. "I'm here on my people's rite of passage, a test of endurance. My mission takes me across these lands." The familiarity of her words struck him. A test of survival. She was here by choice, to prove herself, while he'd been left here with no choice at all. He considered his response, studying her as she did him. "They call me Jax," he said finally, the name sounding foreign even to his own ears after so long. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to share the way back." Her expression remained impassive, though there was a flicker of amusement in her silver eyes. "There is no simple way back, Jax. Only those who know this world intimately can traverse it." He let out a breath, glancing at the ground, then back at her. "Well, maybe I could use a guide." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Your survival has been impressive, but I don't have time to babysit. My own path is one I must follow alone." He met her gaze, his determination unyielding. "I've managed on my own this long. I won't slow you down." They stood in silence for a long moment, neither willing to give ground. Then, with a slight nod, she relented. "Very well. she said, turning to continue through the dense foliage. "But if you fall behind, I won't wait." As he followed her into the shadows of the alien forest, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The forest was endless. Every step through the thick alien terrain felt like another challenge, a reminder of how small he was on this world. Jax moved carefully, each step calculated as he tried to match the pace of the silent figure ahead. Kayla, with her sleek armor and her silent, predatory grace, seemed to glide through the foliage without effort. Compared to her, he felt clumsy, the weight of his gear and makeshift tools dragging him down. She hadn't spoken much since they'd started their journey. She'd only given the barest explanation of her mission, a rite of passage, something sacred to her people. The details were still vague, and her gaze would turn distant whenever he asked. But he could tell from her steady movements and unyielding focus that this was more than just a simple task. It was something she had trained for, something that defined her. The day passed slowly as they trekked deeper into the forest. Strange, twisting trees loomed above them, their dark purple leaves casting shadows that shifted and danced with the breeze. Every now and then, he would catch a glimmer of movement, a fleeting shadow or the faintest flash of bioluminescent eyes watching from afar. "Keep your movements quiet," Kayla murmured, breaking the silence for the first time in hours. "The creatures here have sensitive hearing. They're drawn to sudden sounds." Jax nodded, adjusting his pace to be even slower. He'd spent years learning the ins and outs of this planet's wildlife, the way predators lurked in the shadows and prey disguised themselves in plain sight. But Kayla seemed to know things he didn't. Knowledge passed down from her people, insights that only the natives of this world could understand. They came to a small clearing, where a wide, shimmering river cut through the land. The water was a translucent blue, catching the dim light and reflecting it in shades of green and violet. Kayla knelt by the riverbank, filling a small canteen from her belt. "You may drink here," she said, gesturing to the water. "It's purified by natural filters within the riverbed." Jax knelt beside her, cupping his hands and taking a long drink. The water was cool and crisp, a welcome relief in the heavy air. As he drank, he glanced at Kayla, watching as she scanned the area, her eyes sharp and alert. "So, this mission of yours," he ventured, keeping his voice low, "is it something all of your people have to do?" Kayla didn't look at him, her attention still focused on their surroundings. "It is a tradition of the Virkesh. When we reach a certain age, we are sent into the wild to retrieve a relic from the ancient sites. It is a test of endurance and strength." "And you're supposed to do it alone?" he asked, both impressed and slightly unsettled by the idea. She finally turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, it is a trial we must face without assistance. To survive is to prove oneself worthy of the clan." He nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. For her, this was more than a mission. It was a test of identity, a rite that determined her place among her people. He couldn't help but respect her dedication, even if her attitude toward him remained distant. As they moved to leave the clearing, a sudden rustling in the trees made them both freeze. Kayla's hand shot to her weapon, her body tensing as she scanned the shadows. Jax followed her gaze, his pulse quickening as he saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching them from the underbrush. "Don't move," Kayla whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's a scythen. They hunt in packs." Jax kept still, his heart hammering as more pairs of eyes emerged from the darkness, each one fixed on them with predatory intent. He'd heard of scythens before, creatures with lean, muscular bodies and razor-sharp fangs, their scales shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. They were silent killers, moving with an eerie grace that made them nearly impossible to escape. Kayla took a step back, her movement slow and deliberate. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her hand still on her weapon. "We'll need to move carefully. Sudden movements will provoke them." Jax nodded, following her lead as they began to edge away from the scythens. His eyes darted between the creatures, his mind racing as he tried to anticipate their movements. One wrong step, one misjudged sound, and they'd be under attack. The scythens watched them closely, their bodies coiled and ready to strike. Kayla kept her gaze steady, her expression calm even as she guided him backward through the trees. Jax marveled at her composure. She was focused, unflinching, every movement precise and calculated. They reached the edge of the clearing, slipping into the cover of thicker foliage. Kayla raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. They crouched low, hidden from view as the scythens prowled the clearing, their glowing eyes scanning the forest in search of prey. Jax held his breath, watching as the creatures sniffed the air, their sleek bodies moving with fluid grace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the scythens lost interest, slipping back into the shadows and disappearing from sight. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his muscles ease. That was close. Kyla didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the clearing. She watched the creatures disappear, her eyes narrowing with a mix of focus and intensity. Finally, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You are fortunate," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of something else. "Had I not been here, you would not have survived." He met her gaze, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe, but I've made it this far." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his bravado. "Surviving on luck will not keep you alive on this world." They continued their journey, moving deeper into the forest. The terrain grew denser, the trees towering overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Strange plants brushed against his legs as they walked, leaving faint, glowing streaks on his skin. He could feel the weight of the planet's wildness pressing down on him, a reminder of how small he was in the grand scheme of this alien world. The day dragged on, and he struggled to keep up with Kayla's relentless pace. She moved with the ease of someone who had lived among these trees all her life, her steps silent and precise. Every now and then, she would glance back at him, her gaze cool and assessing, as if constantly weighing his worth. Finally, as the light began to fade, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest. Kayla stopped, surveying the landscape with a practiced eye. "We'll rest here," she said, her voice quiet. "There are fewer predators on the high ground." Jack sank to the ground, grateful for the chance to rest. His legs ached, and his hands were scraped from pushing through the dense foliage. But despite his exhaustion, he felt a strange satisfaction. He was here, alive, and he'd kept pace with someone who clearly knew this land far better than he did. Kayla sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant trees. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something in her expression, a hint of weariness. Perhaps, or maybe even a glimmer of regret. "This journey," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's important to you, isn't it?" She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It is more than a journey. It is a test, one that determines who we are and where we belong." He looked at her, sensing the weight of her words. She wasn't just a guide, wasn't just another survivor like him. She was someone with a purpose, a mission that went beyond survival. In a way, he envied her. She had a goal, a direction. All he'd had for years was the constant struggle to stay alive. They sat in silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the forest in shadow. For the first time, he felt a faint sense of peace, a calm he hadn't known since his crash. With Kayla beside him, the planet felt a little less hostile, a little less lonely. As night fell, he glanced over at her, a question lingering on his mind. "Why did you let me come with you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away, her gaze distant as she considered his question. Finally, she looked at him, her silver eyes steady. "Perhaps because even in the most unlikely of places, we can find allies." He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. In this strange, unpredictable world, they were bound together by a simple fact. They were both survivors, clinging to life in a place that seemed determined to test them at every turn. And for now, that was enough. The night stretched on, dark and silent, save for the soft rustling of alien creatures moving through the forest below. Jack sat on the rocky outcrop beside Kayla, staring into the shadows and wondering how much longer he'd be able to keep up. His muscles ached, his body pushed to the edge of exhaustion, but he could see that Kayla was just as weary. She tried to hide it, keeping her gaze steady and her expression unreadable, but he could tell the journey was wearing on her too. They'd traveled together for days now, deeper and deeper into the heart of the planet, and he sensed that they were close to her destination, the place she'd called the ancient site. She hadn't given him details, But he knew it was more than a relic. It was the culmination of her journey, the proof that she was worthy of her people. And though he'd started out with no goal beyond survival, he now felt that he was a part of something larger. A purpose had woven itself into his journey, entwined with Kayla's. Just as dawn broke, Kayla rose, her eyes set with a newfound determination. "It's time," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of finality. Jack stood, following her without question. They descended from the rocky outcrop and trekked through dense underbrush, the forest growing thicker with each step. The landscape changed subtly as they walked. The trees twisted in strange formations, their trunks blackened and scarred as if marked by ancient fires. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Finally, they reached a large clearing surrounded by massive stone pillars, each one carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the clearing stood a raised platform, its surface covered in strange, metallic inscriptions that seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. Kayla approached the platform with reverence, her steps slow and careful. She reached the center and knelt, her hand resting on the engraved surface. The light from the symbols grew brighter, casting a warm glow across her face. Jax could see the awe in her expression, the weight of her people's history reflected in her silver eyes. "This is it," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The relic that holds the knowledge of my ancestors." As she touched the platform, a low hum filled the air, and the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves into a pattern he couldn't understand. The ground trembled, and a beam of light shot up from the platform, illuminating the space above. Kayla took a deep breath, her face calm but resolute. She removed a small device from her belt and placed it on the platform, where it absorbed the light until it glowed with an ethereal energy. She stood, turning to Jax. "This device will carry the knowledge back to my people," she explained, her voice steady. "It's the final piece of my journey. Now I can return." He nodded, a sense of pride swelling within him as he watched her fulfill her mission. But just as he began to feel the relief of closure, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows surrounding the clearing. His heart pounded as he turned to see shapes moving in the darkness, large, hulking creatures with glowing eyes and claws that glinted in the dim light. "Sethens." Kayla's hand went to her sword, her stance shifting as she prepared for the inevitable fight. "They've been drawn by the energy," she said, her voice tight. "They can sense it." Jax drew his blaster, his eyes scanning the advancing predators. "So what's the plan?" "We hold them off," Kayla replied, her voice calm and determined. "And we don't let them take this relic." The creatures moved closer, their growls growing louder as they circled the clearing. One lunged toward them, but Kayla was ready. Her blade flashed as she sliced through the air, meeting the creature mid-leap. It fell with a shriek, but the others only grew more aggressive, closing in with renewed fury. Jax fired his blaster, the shots lighting up the clearing as he aimed for the creature's vulnerable spots. They fought side by side, their movements instinctively coordinated, each covering the other's blind spots as they faced the pack. But the Scythans kept coming, relentless and seemingly endless. Jax's blaster grew hot in his hands, and his arms burned from the constant strain of aiming and firing. Kayla fought with equal intensity, her blade cutting through the air in precise, lethal arcs, but he could see that she was tiring, just as it seemed the creatures might overwhelm them. A faint light pulsed from Kayla's device on the platform. The energy from the relic surged outward, creating a bright, protective barrier around the clearing. The Scythans recoiled, hissing as they backed away from the light, their aggression finally subsiding. Breathing hard, Jax looked over at Kayla, who stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the device. "It's protecting us?" he asked, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Kayla nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "The knowledge of my ancestors. It has the power to repel creatures drawn to darkness." As they made their way back through the forest, the journey felt lighter, each step carrying a sense of accomplishment and finality. They traveled in silence, but the quiet was no longer tense. It was comfortable, filled with a mutual respect born from shared trials and victories. When they reached the edge of the forest, Kayla stopped, her gaze turning distant once more. She looked at him, her expression filled with a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. This is where we part ways, she said softly. I will return to my people with the relic, and you will continue your journey. Wherever it may take you. He nodded, the weight of their farewell settling over him. Guess this is it. Then, Kayla held out her hand, a rare gesture among her people. He clasped it, their grip firm, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd been through together. As she turned to leave, he called out, his voice carrying through the trees. Goodbye, Kayla. She glanced back, a faint smile on her lips. Goodbye, Jax. May your path be clear, and your spirit strong. And with that, she disappeared into the forest, her figure fading into the shadows.